Hi everyone! Today I want to talk about Twilight. The saga that made 3.4 billion worldwide, broke any type of record and became a phenomenon in fandom bordering on mass hysteria. This month marks the 10th anniversary of the release of the first film, which apart from making me feel very old, also made me want to rewatch the old saga. So, 10 years from its release, how good or bad actually was Twilight? And did it change in any way pop culture? And what kind of analysis we can make today that is not the same as what we did before? A positive claim that can be made for Twilight now is that it definitely shaken up Hollywood's core idea that whereas movies aimed at boys are generally considered universal, those made for girls were not. Twilight had a large impact in subverting the idea that something aimed at teen girls has inherently no commercial or cultural value, and it helped in normalizing girls in fandom in the public sphere, something which was, for the major part, solely recognized to boys, and that had more nerdy and private connotations. This nichification of women has gone mainstream since Twilight, with movies like The Hunger Games or the Divergent series. The commercials market realization that teen girls make up for some pretty lucrative audiences has led to a series of shows and movies with this in mind. The problem is that in an attempt to duplicate what appears to be successful, these media are neither smart or insightful, perpetuating the same ideal that branded Twilight for life. That teen girls should be made fun of because what is marketed to them is, well, silly. That's why a phenomenon like Twilight has been marked as the end of feminism. Now, it's not like the so-called post-feminist narratives like those in Bridget Jones or Sex and the City were particularly illuminating. The likes of Bridget or Carrie might be financially independent, but their main objective in life was basically getting the man. However, rewatching Twilight 10 years later, I still see a lot of its initial problematic elements. For one, Edward and Bella's relationship has a fundamental imbalance of power, being that he's the strong, immortal vampire and she's the clumsy, fragile human. This is not that odd. Power has always been a dominant theme in vampire narratives. But the discourse of power in Twilight is also strongly rooted in gendered differences, as well as stained in a way to appeal to the watcher/reader, the teen girl. Whereas Dracula, for example, may be mesmerizing, but it is also clearly dangerous, Edward is portrayed as a tragic hero that has been involuntarily transformed as a vampire, and that further leads a life of constraint to his predatory impulses.
I don't want to be a monster.
This makes him the perfect epitome of the so-called sympathetic male vampire, a persecuted and soulful individual at odds with its status as vampire, which renders him desirable, specifically to teen girls. The appeal to Edward and his relationship with Bella can be summed up as the unhealthy fascination for the bad boy, the desire for the girl to save him, narrative which has informed a large part of media aimed at females since its inception, which obviously results in an unwholesome relationship. Edward and Bella are both a forbidden fruit of sorts. He is the actual sin, she is any girl who ever wanted to feel desired beyond all reason or control. Edward saves Bella in multiple occasions, pretty much in every minute of every movie, but Bella also saves Edward. Her love offers him redemption. Needless to say that this frame of mind is incredibly dangerous in real life, but is unfortunately still highly romanticized by media.
I need you to show me what you want to do to me. Punish me. Show me how bad it can be. I want you to show me the worst. It's the only way I can understand.
That this power structure that I was talking about is largely defined along gendered terms is clear in the way in which Bella describes herself and Edward. Whenever he talks to Bella, he either assumes a commanding role or a patronizing tone, ridiculing Bella. In the book, there is actually written that He was enunciating every syllable as if he were talking to someone mentally handicapped. Bella grows increasingly insecure, often trying to find reasons for his behavior within herself, and eventually helps him in maintaining this control over her. As the story progresses, Bella forgets the few anchors she had didn't revolve around Edward. Her friends, her parents, the school, hobbies. She doesn't tell us about herself because she's too busy talking about Edward. In this sense, Edward's behavior is one strongly related to the concept of hegemonic masculinity, as he conforms to the whiteness, heterosexuality, physical strength, self-confidence, chivalric masculinity. At the same and opposite side of the spectrum, Bella is insecure and submissive. Edward is not the only character that conforms to hegemonic masculinity. In fact, the whole narrative aims at positioning Bella in a patriarchal system. At the beginning, Twilight presents us some unconventional family settings, with Bella's mother being affectionate but lacking maturity, and her father being caring but emotionally incapable. Even within these alternative structures, Bella still assumes the role of caretaker, assuming the traditional tasks of cooking, cleaning, and doing laundry, while Charlie watches baseball and drinks beer. But then Bella leaves her family to join that of the Cullens, which is unmistakably guided by Carlisle. Carlisle not only literally created a vampire family, but his job as a doctor is described as a calling that makes him a master of self-control. On the other hand, Esme is described as the art of the family. So whereas Carlisle is the head of the family, the one with the career that lives also in the public sphere, Esme's special personality trait is her ability to love passionately. Bella Swan is not a heroine. Even 10 years later, we can agree with that, right? She's the typical damsel in distress. Extraordinarily clumsy, fragile, and insecure, she's in constant need of salvation from either Edward or Jacob, as she appears to be utterly incapable of living in the world by herself. That's why both Edward and Bella seem to come out of a 19th century novel or the Victorian society, which in the books Bella explicitly learns romance from. Edward, like Darcy from Pride and Prejudice for example, appear to be initially disgusted by Bella, although we then learn in both stories that this is not the case. Similarly to Rochester in Jane Eyre, Edward attempts to control the woman he loves, and just like Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights hopes to become more civilized, Edward wishes to be more human. But Victorian romances usually end up with the marriage. In Twilight, the story moves forwards, but it still delivers the same narrative. Bella's fierceness in the latest movie, maybe the last two movies, doesn't come from her newfound vampirism, but at her self-sacrificial features. We still don't know what else Bella does or what she likes outside of Edward, just like we did before she turned, but now Stephanie Meyer insists on how she found a new equilibrium, something that was missing before when she was single. The new equilibrium is that she's a wife and a mother. Just like Victorian novels, Edward is revealed to be the prince. To Bella, he is undoubtedly good, even before we learn about his backstory or moral struggle he later reveals.
I'm designed to kill.
I don't care.
I've killed people before.
It does not matter.
One element that is fundamentally different in Bella's characterization as opposed to the Victorian women is her passion towards Edward that makes some contend about her sexual liberation and has made others praise the chastity or purity of the story.
Stop it!
I'm sorry.
You're stronger than I thought.
Yeah, I wish I could say the same.
First of all, I agree with Professor Seifert that labeled the saga as abstinence porn, in the sense that Bella is objectified exactly because a loss of virginity is linked with the loss of, well, everything else. Of course, the more that Bella and Edward didn't have sex, the more we wanted them to. But that is also partly because Stephen Meyer made a great job at sexualizing abstinence. The fact that Edward takes the role of protector of Bella's blood, which is highly sexualized in vampire folklore and in Twilight as well, render her sexuality powerless.
It's you. Your scent. It's like a drug to me. You're like my own personal brand of heroin.
She becomes the object of Edward's virtue in his constant fight for self-control and abstinence. Secondly, simply because Twilight doesn't engage in the male gaze because Bella talks in the first person, doesn't mean that the narrative becomes any less sexual. Because in her opinions and thoughts, Bella takes up a perspective on herself as prey, one that wouldn't mind dying at the hands of a fascinating figure such as Edward. As typical to any vampire tale, desire for human blood is associated with sexual desire, making sex and violence inextricably linked. Potential and actual violence is amply prevalent since the very beginning of Twilight. The atmosphere, the music, the direction are all used in a way to bring that tension on the screen. Edward's ability to harm Bella is a key factor of their relationship that continues in every installment of the saga, even when Bella is surrounded by what the story would like to make safer figures like Jacob. New Moon begins with Bella finding herself in mortal danger after a paper cut caused arousal in every vampire around her. When she slaps one of Jacob's werewolves gang, his rage morphs him into a wolf. Also in New Moon, Bella meets Emily Young, the girl engaged to Sam, the head of the werewolves, and finds out that her face has been disfigured by her soon-to-be husband. When Jacob learns that Bella is about to have sex with Edward, he seizes her aggressively, and when she finally has sex with Edward, she's covered in marks and bruises. Why? The point is that all boys in the Twilight saga are portrayed as inherently violent. Although they recognize it and feel sorry for it most of the times, this also appears to be their nature, something which can be changed. Because of this awareness, both Edward and Jacob are seen as the good guys, in comparison to the bad guys, which instead live freely and wildly. The core message then is that all boys are inclined to violence, but the good ones try to fight their instincts. Katz defined this concept the chivalry trap, the notion that the good guys position themselves as women's protectors against the bad guys who would otherwise prey on them. That's how in Twilight, masculinity is unproblematically portrayed as fundamentally violent, while femininity as inherently vulnerable. Yet, since these dynamics are extremely romanticized, they're very difficult to spot. That's also why, in my opinion, Midnight Sun, the book from Edward's point of view, was never actually released. Because if you read the available chapters online, you'll see how Edward's violence can't and isn't masked as anything more than it is: raw, cruel, and staggering. If Midnight Sun were to be published as it is written right now, the dream facade of the monster who is actually a good guy would be very more difficult to sell. At least for the first acts of the story is an actual vampire, and that's not sexy, that's scary. So, these were a few of my thoughts after rewatching the Twilight saga. Let me know if you agree with them and if you have anything else to add. There were other things to add actually, but that would have required a 2 hours video. I want to end on a positive note. This is obviously a media analysis, but that doesn't take into consideration the entertainment that is derived from, you know, what each one of us likes to watch, even though it may be problematic, and we know it may be problematic. You can definitely still like stuff that you criticize. It is not an or situation. So if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more from me, subscribe and hit the notification bell button to make sure to receive notifications for when I upload. Thanks.